Just for the people that are watching, we've checked in and we talked about the topic for today is survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and just some self-care tips. You know, be mindful of what's happening for you, and do take time out if you need to. If you're watching separately, you've got a chance just to hit pause and think about it and come back to it another time. So quite a distressing topic for anybody who's experienced this issue. So triggers might happen. You notice triggers. What might triggers look like, do you think? How might people feel like something's coming up for them? Panic.
Yeah. Maybe upset.
Yeah. Angry. Fearful. And also sometimes dissociation. So that's quite typical. So feeling like you can't hear what I'm saying, or feeling like you're distant somewhere, that would be a really typical reaction to talking about things like that. And that's because that is a survival strategy, to distance. We're quite clever as human beings, you know, I'm not really here. So if you find that it's really difficult to hear, then just be aware of that and be kind to yourself. Maybe get up, have a wander around, and make a choice about whether it's right to come back or not. So today we're going to talk about 3 areas. Let's have a look. I'm going to do this first. Okay, so we're going to have a brief look at neurology. So we're going to understand about what's happening in the body. We're going to look at the topic of trauma, which is broad. It's not just about childhood sexual abuse. It can be PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It can be type 1 or type 2. So type 1 is, you know, been a road traffic accident, and it's a one-off difficult thing that's happened, and people keep getting flashbacks, or combat PTSD, or police often have PTSD. And then there's a type of trauma, type 2 trauma, which is much more difficult to work with, and that's the childhood sexual abuse. So trauma, we'll have a look at that. So there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. That's a really great book to look at. And that covers all kinds of trauma, not just childhood sexual abuse. But the treatment for childhood sexual abuse trauma is actually quite different to the type of treatment that you would give somebody with flashbacks from an accident or something like that. So the general principle for any anxiety, and PTSD comes under anxiety, is to avoid avoidance. So to stop avoiding things. But actually, we know from the neurology is that if you make somebody who was abused as a child remember and go through step by step all of the trauma, what do you think is happening? Reliving it, re-traumatizing. So we found that that's not so helpful. And it does work if people can make it to the end, but very few people make it to the end of exposure therapy with straightforward CBT techniques of exposing to the trauma. So we'll talk about trauma, and then we'll look at working practically. Service has got us 3 books, which we're going to use like a library system. All of the slides refer to the book. I would suggest that if you're going to use the exercises in the books, that you tweak them for the client that you have. So use that paperwork as a basis to make it personalised, because abusers can be very different, and if it talks about your father then, and it's not the father, that would be difficult to deal with. So making the paperwork fit for the person would be really good. Okay, so that's an overview of what we're going to do today. Now, neurology. I am not a neurologist, so so I probably, if you think about what a chef is as the expert neurologist, and think about somebody who can put fish fingers and chips in the oven, that's about my level of neurology. Okay, so I'm not claiming to be a great neurologist, but what we know is that polyvagal theory is big in this area. Okay, so there's just a little description of it there. Stephen Porges has a very marvelous text that I cannot understand. So it's very impenetrable, but then there are some more easy to understand. Deb Dana, she writes well on it in a much more accessible way than Stephen Porges, who is obviously writing for people who understand long words and impenetrable sentences. Okay, but basically, phantom time. Sorry. Okay, we've got all the things there, but yeah. Okay, is that all right? Can you see? So it's talking about how the nervous system is important in how we manage trauma. And he talks about polyvagal theory, and he's basing it on an evolutionary neuropsychological understanding of the vagus nerve. So basically, as a complex system, we have a very complex nervous system. And so he's looking at all the different types of nervous system. I've got a little picture of it, a few slides on. There we go. So I thought I wouldn't draw it for you. I did it because it's such a lovely drawing, this. So you have a look at the social engagement, the nervous system that's around the face. It's called the ventral vagus system. So this is, what do you think? If you've got lots of nerves around the face and it's a social engagement, what do you think that is there for humans? Think about what information we get from looking at faces. Yeah, so when we're sussing out a situation, what's our first indicator that there's something wrong?
Facially, we're always reading each other's faces to see if there's something different.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also a key thing to, let's just flick on a little bit. Oh. Sound. So we have an ability, because of how our ears work, we have muscle in our ears that allows us to understand tone in a way that reptiles can't. So think about, in relation to childhood sexual abuse, face and tone, it gives you a different perception of why this is particularly difficult for us as creatures that are we're mammals, so we are made to be raised by mothers, fathers. We have a long period of childhood where parents are really important. So what's the importance of a parent for a child?
Should be protection, shouldn't it? And guidance. They're your example as well, aren't they? So take them to be what normal is.
Yeah.
Should be safe, environment, consistent.
Yeah, survival, basically. Babies can't survive without parents. Okay, and if we're looking at this polyvagal idea about how our nervous system and our bodies are wired, the whole face and tone is really important. So thinking about childhood sexual abuse, growing up with that nervous system, how is that going to affect children while they're developing? Listening to parents' faces.
Can't trust adults or parents.
Really, just fear, isn't it?
It's complete confusion, isn't it? So mixed messages, and particularly with something, so often perpetrators, not all perpetrators, but often perpetrators will say that they're loving that person. I used to work in prison with vulnerable prisoners who had abused children, and there was one man in there that just couldn't see that what he had done was wrong and that he had loved his daughter. Okay, so tone, loving tone, facial expression, probably when all this was going on, quite loving. And then that mixed message with what's going on. So huge difficulty. Play is a mixture. So we've got the three systems. Let's just go back to that slide. We've got the ventral vagus system that helps us feel safe, show up, communicate with people, in connection with others. It's a place of safety. So in the foyer at church, hopefully it's a place where everybody's ventral vagal system is working really well, faces, tones, getting on, all of that kind of thing. And then the amber is that fight flight. So when our ventral vagal system picks up that there's danger and it's not all friendly and happy, then we might get the fight flight. So going back to the picture, there's the have a look at these systems here, which is those things there. Okay, it affects the fight flight, and people go into what we're thinking about as a panic attack. So it affects the chest. You can see there's some yellow around here, heart. So all of them, all of the green, the red and the yellow are all around, but when they get activated in different ways, it has different effects. And when you're playing, there's a mixture of the green and the amber. Yeah, it's a bit exciting. And having the green and the amber together is playful. But if it's just the amber, then it's fight flight. Okay. Intimacy, you have a mixture of the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal. So on its own, the dorsal vagal is the red, and that is shut down. And that's why when couples argue, often an intimate sexual engagement afterwards happens, because it's kind of shuts down and relaxes. Everything shuts down. It's not like the hyper of play. So you've got a mixture with the intimate of the ventral vagal, face, everything's okay, but also that taking down the relaxation and all of that kind of thing going on at the same time. But on its own, ventral vagal is freeze. So that's why it's called polyvagal theory, because it's a mixture of these different nervous systems taking over, and a mixture of those things can have different effects for you. Okay, so that's probably quite a lot to take in.
I was just thinking about the other kind of facial expression.
Yeah.
You know, if it's violent, abusive, or if it's alcohol and there's anger. So you might be getting loving words during the daytime, or you're my favourite, or you're my, you know, my best daughter, whatever. But actually, when the anger takes over, or the need takes over, you've got a different facial expression going on. So
yeah,
again, confusion and just horrendous, really.
Yeah. So when we're working with adult survivors, it's important to take into consideration that there's some neurological stuff happening for this person as well, and to have a basic understanding. I don't think you need to understand it fully, but just an appreciation of what's happening in the body. Because if somebody is in shutdown in a therapy room, how useful is therapy going to be? Okay, it's not going to, well, they probably won't remember anything. There'll be a lot less social engagement. So we want to try and keep people in the green for as much as we can. And if they dip into the yellow, we need to try and get them back to the green. So thinking about all we know about communication skills, what kinds of things do you think we could do with clients if we see them slipping into the red or the amber?
We need to keep that warm engagement going.
Yeah,
definitely. And that can be our facial expressions to whoever's in front of us. But I think to choose words as well that would continue to engage. It's starting to identify what they're going through potentially. Know, would be rightly chosen. Yeah.
Words are important, even more so tone. Okay, because we're talking to a nervous system here, and the brain understands words, but if that part of the brain is shut down, tone really super important. What other exercises could you do to bring somebody up out of fight, flight? Breathing exercises, grounding exercises, getting them to have a look. So we'll come back to some of that in a bit. But that's just the basic understanding of the neurology there. And something called co-regulation that I haven't brought the book actually. Steven Seagal and Dan Seagal. He writes a lot about co-regulation. So when you think about a baby, you're thinking about the neural system. And if you watch a baby and a caregiver, what happens to the face of mom and face of baby? Yeah. So mirror and tone, we can call it co-regulation or attunement. So keeping your place as the therapist, as the helper. In this scenario, you're almost like the mother, okay? And you're helping the client to attune to you and your calm place. if you're upset by what you're hearing, how's that going to be? Yeah. So to remember actually that nothing bad is happening in the room with you.
Yeah.
The worst of it has finished. They have already experienced the worst of it. You might be experiencing it for the first time, hearing it and imagining it, but actually that's not happening now. And remembering that this is a place of safety, and this is actually a good thing that they're talking about this, because this is a, that's why we managed to take our children for horrible injections, even though they hate it, because we know that they need that. So enabling us to keep calm, because we know that what we're doing is a good thing, and them talking about it is a good thing. So holding on to that is important in a therapy session. So we're giving the client the idea that it's safe. It's safe to be here. It's safe to talk about it, actually. And that's the message. You've already been through the worst. That's not happening now. You survived that. You're going to survive this. And it's that confidence that you can give, and that steadying co-regulation that's really important. So before we say anything or do anything, getting the atmosphere right is important. And I think that's why clients don't often come with childhood sexual abuse. However, if they've already been to what's it called again? Not First Steps here, is it? No, the NHS service.
So Healthy Minds.
Healthy Minds, sorry. Still called something different, I think. So if they've already been to Healthy Minds and they've tried to engage them in therapy, and the childhood sexual abuse has come up, then they might come knowing that they need to address things. But generally speaking, often people don't come with that as an initial presentation. But it might be that we pick people up on a different part of their journey. I'm just pausing.
Thank you. See you later.
It is recording, yeah, but don't worry. See you later. Okay, so moving on to trauma. So as mentioned earlier, trauma can happen in all kinds of ways for all kinds of reasons, but we're concentrating on a narrow window of trauma and a very specific kind. So there's lots of things out there that you can find, but I think the Bessel van der Kolk is a good book. There's also a book that's similar by Babette Rothschild. Yeah, I can't think of the title, but I'll get that available for you. Okay. I quite like the workbook. It's a good read. Bessel van der Kolk is a good read if you want to read the whole book. I don't know if anybody's read that.
I dipped in and out of it a lot.
Yeah, it's quite accessible, isn't it?
He's the way that he terms are label terms.
Yeah.
But then he does go deeper as well, so you can choose a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's made me turn to dictionary and index a lot.
Yeah.
But it, very accessible.
Mm-hmm. The workbook's really helpful. They've had, I don't know if you've come across Genius Reads, but they kind of make it very accessible, and they talk about each paragraph and pull out the meaning and with a box at the end. So I think this is a good option. But if you want to pad it out, read stories and case studies, that's a good thing to get the book that goes with it. So thinking back to the slides we just looked at about polyvagal theory, those recounting trauma have the same biological trauma as though they were reliving it. So as they are in therapy and they're talking about it, it might get their fight flight going, it might get their freeze response. How do you know if somebody's frozen?
Facial expressions immediately.
Mhm.
Yeah, change.
Yeah.
And breathing sometimes. Yeah.
They can't go.
They can't talk. Yeah, there's a very specific reason for that. So this thing here, reliving trauma, can be addictive because when somebody's reliving trauma, their pain is blocked out. So, well, if you think about it in terms of if you're about to be eaten by an animal, it makes sense that your body just shuts down all your pain receivers. So if you're in freeze, you don't feel pain. And if we flick back to the picture, you see where all this red stuff is here. That's all blocked out and it goes up through this primal part of the brain stem. Some texts it's called the reptilian brain. So it just cuts off that pain, and then you see animals go into freeze, and in that moment they're not feeling pain, and that's often associated with cutting as well. So people are not feeling the pain when they cut. It's an emotional, yeah. So actually, if you've got a lot of emotional pain, it can be addictive to keep reliving trauma, which is really unhelpful at the same time. But if you think about it in the context of if you've shut down and something terrible is happening, that actually it's a great survival strategy as well. It's actually very bad for you to be in shutdown for very often chemically. So whilst it can be addictive, it's also very bad for the long term. I think they did some studies with baboons, and because they've got quite a social structure, and baboons who were at the bottom of that pecking order often died sooner, often had more heart issues. So going back to that picture, you'll see that the red vagal nerve, here's the dorsal vagal nerve, is through all those internal organs, so it's not good for you. Okay. So then you've got, in the brain, you've got a decrease of activity in the Broca's area of the brain, and that's your speech centres. So, but an increase in the Broadband area, which is images. So people get images, but they actually find it very difficult to talk about it and find the words to put to it. And there's huge activity on the right side of the brain, which is, it's not complete, but right is more emotional, creative, left is more logical. So much more activity on the right hand side of the brain. So going to our strategies at some later point, engaging the right side with drawing and things like that is quite helpful, because we're working with brain activity. Okay. Okay. So now we're not just talking about the nervous system throughout the body. We're having a look at the brain, and then we look at the the different types. So this isn't meant to be mirroring. So we have the reptilian basic functions, the limbic deals with senses and pleasure. So amygdala and all of those brain structures around that. And the neocortex, strategic planning. Okay, so 3 levels of brain engagement and different responses. We've already talked about the social engagement, the fight, flight, and collapse, but they're not. No. The way I put that looks like they're synced, but they're not meant to be synced. So actually, it's the other way around, isn't it? So if we're okay with that, if we're in the green on the nervous system, actually we're in the neocortex. We're able to think more clearly.
Yeah, sure.
And if we're in collapse, it's the basic functions.
I love the colours, by the way. Hard to read, but they're just beautiful.
Oh dear. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I think it's my brain.
Okay. Another picture. The brain. So we're looking at, our higher functions in the prefrontal cortex. And we have a loop feedback through our amygdala and our hypothalamus, and so that's affected. It's all close to this and our olfactory. That's why smells are very evocative, because they're right near to this part of the brain. So sometimes a smell, particularly for survivors of abuse. I worked with a lady who was raped at knife point in the autumn, walking home, and there's a lot of leaf mould. So that smell just reminds her and takes her back, because your olfactory centres are right round by all of that emotional stuff. So while that's being triggered, the smells and things, and so that's why people who can be triggered by aftershave or sweat, all of those things. Okay, so back to the idea of co-regulation or attunement. We've already talked about gut reaction between infants and parents. And when the parent is a source of distress, then actually that is really difficult. Is the screen? Should we turn the lights off? Would that help?
I think it's the light coming through the window at the back there that's shining straight on the screen.
Try it.
What about if we tip it a little bit?
That'd be better.
Actually, I did
Yeah.
want it to actually. Yeah, thank you.
I probably shouldn't have done the dark.
There is a bit of reflection.
Yeah. Sorry, Megan, is that all right for you?
That's fine, yeah. Yeah.
That's so much better, thank you.
So imagine when you've got that a complete dependence upon a parent who is also abusive. What that must do to the whole system, turning it into just the most disorganized and terrifying sense, where everything about how your brain works and is meant to work is kind of set against itself. Yeah. And we taking it back to Bowlby and his idea of attachment we're talking about, which we haven't really got time to go into today, but I'm sure on your other training we'll look at attachment theory. It gives this disorganized sense of attachment. I really need, but actually that person who I really need is completely terrifying to me. Messes with your head. And in order to help our clients, we have to get into an attachment with them. And that's why this kind of work takes quite a long time, and probably why the NHS can't afford to engage in it. Because actually they need to attach in order to get some repair in the attachment.
That's really worrying, isn't it? If it's from what people have said about how common it is. If, you know, I haven't appreciated how much the need was from what people have said. It's more common than I anticipated.
Yeah.
So there's no access to everything, isn't there?
No, that's all.
Easy
It's
access.
a whole
Swaying
important group of people that
Yeah.
are on their own.
So there's a bit of a disagreement about DTD, which is development trauma disorder, which hasn't actually made it into the DSM, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual. But actually it has a very specific profile. So adults, problems making friends and relationships in general, that's to do with, what's that symptom to do with?
I imagine it's because of part of what we've been saying about those conflicting messages and not being able to trust people, because you get one vibe, but then behind it there's something else going on.
Somebody might seem very friendly,
Yes.
but how can you trust them? Anxiety, never know when something's going to kick off. Living on eggshells all the time, don't want to upset one parent or another, or brother or sister, or in case something happens. Depression, what causes depression, do you think?
The sense of worthlessness.
Worthlessness. And why do you think adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse feel worthless?
I think coming back to what
Melody?
Melody, thank you. It was saying about the shame association and that feeling that they might have brought it on themselves somehow.
Yeah.
It's being used.
Yeah. No boundaries. I'm not worth boundaries. My body is open to be used and abused. And also grooming. Nobody's going to believe you. You're just a child.
And then that problem with identity becomes really acute for a child.
Yeah.
Not having had that mirroring or attachments, it then starts that feeling of, well, who am I? What am I?
Yes.
Where do I belong? What am I about? Big question.
Which are, Dan Siegel does a really good job of picking that up. And this, the neuroscience of human relationships. Louis Cozolino, also a really good book. Yes, if you've got a few £100, you could kick yourself out with a wonderful book. But you could probably borrow it from a library.
Yes. Which library? Oh, the general library.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, talk about grooming, you won't believe it, they're not being believed.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Gosh, that's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
So that's really important, and that's why
Yeah.
we've made some big changes in how services deal with children in terms of believing them. Weight issues. So Caroline Spring, who writes the book Recovery is My Best Revenge, was a child that was used in ritualised sexual abuse by a ring of people. There's not huge amounts of evidence, but anecdotally I see it a lot that people who have been abused as children often carry weight around this part of their body, and there's initial research that suggests that's to do with the shutdown, the dorsal vagal nerve. So it actually stops you from metabolizing things.
Wow,
That's amazing.
Yeah, and so they've started calling it the trauma tummy.
The other thing about the weight issue is actually trying to appear asexual.
Yeah.
And especially not trying to get rid of femininity. So more the anorexia side, I think is very prejudicing.
Yeah.
And reduces some.
Particularly with eating disorders.
Yeah.
They'll stop development.
Yeah. Or they're going to be putting on weight to not appear attractive.
That makes sense, doesn't it? But that video we watched on the level 4 about the trans lady, she relayed a story when she was treating a young man who was wanting to become a woman, and in that example,
it was the other way around. She called him trans. He wanted to be a man, but it's actually a woman who was sexually abused.
oh, was it?
She didn't fully transition.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. It came out, didn't it? Apologies, I've got my things the wrong way around, but that the person had experienced sexual abuse. I think they've been attacked by a group of people,
And then
that was the reason they were trying to, or what was actually behind the wanting to become the other gender. And actually they worked through it, but it's kind of what you were saying about trying to cover up that gender as a result
Distance
of
from
shame.
it,
Yeah.
distance completely away from
It was almost like trying to become a new person and
Yeah.
have a fresh start.
That won't happen to me if I'm a male or
Yeah.
female, whichever way.
Yeah. Gosh, it's really complicated.
it is complicated. Not all trans people
No,
have
no,
got that in
absolutely,
their
yeah,
past,
of course.
but it is worth exploring sexual history to see if there is some trauma there. Eating disorders. So, what do people get from eating disorders? Control. Okay. So, might not be able to control how people act towards me, but I can control what happens to my body by what I eat or what I don't eat. Yeah. And then what happens is often survivors of childhood sexual abuse, not always, but there's often some neglectful parenting when they become parents. Not always. And so being a neglectful parent, what's that going to do to the child? So on, and so forth. And that's where I hope that now, as a generation dealing with childhood sexual abuse, hopefully that won't then be perpetuated generation on generation. Because even if somebody who's been abused doesn't go on to abuse, they might neglect, which is a form of abuse.
Is that, and I guess they probably, assuming there were two parents with the original victim, they potentially, that there is a second parent that's neglecting them as well, isn't there? In that, and if they're aware of what's going on. So that's quite difficult as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Something that I struggle with is when, say, the mum knows it's going on
Yeah.
and doesn't
Chooses to
step away. But that kind of makes sense now, and that polyvagal theory as well, not just sort of shutting it away.
Yeah.
What's the phrase you use when you
Shutting down.
annexing it?
Yeah. Exiling.
That's it, yeah. So perhaps in those situations, that's what Mom's doing as well.
Yeah, because to allow herself to enter into and empathise with the child will take her back into her own disregarded past, potentially.
And to have to make some serious life changes, which is the right thing to do, of course, but it's quite a horrible thing to acknowledge, isn't it?
Horrible to acknowledge, particularly if they're emotionally dependent or financially dependent upon the person who's the abuser, or terrified of the abuser themselves, or avoiding sexual relationship with the person. Yeah, very complex. Okay. Recovered memories. We like the difficult topic. So generally we tend to remember novelties, so things that have not happened before. So you know, you might have a child that is very traumatized and they had a marvelous holiday once. They'll remember that because it's a novelty. So if you think back to your childhood, we have a sense of the day-to-day, but what do we remember? We remember the things that are out of the ordinary. Some events can be so horrific that they overwhelm the system, so are very difficult. So one of the typical things with PTSD memory is that it has lots of blank spots in it, where people can't access those parts of the memories. They can just remember very horrific novel things that happened, and it's very sensory often. The colour of something, the smell of something, the feel of something, more than a language thing. Yeah, and if somebody's in shutdown, if they're in the red dorsal vagal part of their sensory system, that's they're going to shut down. They might not remember parts of what it is, and then often something can trigger. So Bessel van der Kolk talks about an abuser that was in the paper, seeing the abuser's face triggered a memory for somebody else, who'd completely forgotten about it. But actually recognising that face, I know that's happened with somebody that I've spoken to very recently, seen face on Facebook.
I've had that twice this week. A profile has popped up on Facebook while they've just been on there, or Instagram or something, and it's triggered.
Yeah.
Well, that must be awful as well, because you're not,
Expecting it.
yeah, exactly. Doing something that's probably quite nice, and then all of a sudden.
So generally traumatic memories are inflexible. So the trauma memory is fixed and your mind goes back to that flashback again and again and again. Actually working with a traumatic memory, fleshing it out, potentially can be helpful. What else was happening at the time? All of that kind of thing. Because it's shifting it from a traumatic memory into a normal bad memory, rather than just this pinpoint of horror, which a flashback is.
Yeah.
Does that kind of broaden the horizon or the scope of their life then, rather than it bringing it to that one point then? So it kind of expands their memory of life and everything, I guess, doesn't it?
A bit more every day, obviously not the trauma, but
The rest of the stuff.
the rest of the stuff.
But because that's not the only thing that happened, but that's the only thing that's remembered in a flashback. Memories can be helped through language, reframing, talking about it. So thinking about right-left brain, and particularly writing, we take a memory from the creative right-hand side of the brain into the language and the logic side of the brain. So putting words to things can actually be helpful. And we know that memory is pretty pants. Even if we think we remember, we don't remember accurately, but actually repressed memories are about as accurate as the memories that we think we have. Research shows. And traumatic memories tend to be more disorganised, with vivid sensory aspects to them.
What do you mean by disorganised? Just not accurate, or?
Well, no, but you could remember this chunk here, and then
I
you
see.
can't remember
Not the
how
whole
you
lot.
arrived at
Okay.
this thing, or you might get it all mixed up.
Right, I see what you mean.
But it's not like a consecutive,
Yeah.
nice
Okay.
flowing
Yeah.
memory. This happened and that happened, and because that person said this, then this happened.
Yeah.
You don't remember those links.
The chain of events.
They're just like this, and maybe this appears before
Yeah,
this,
okay.
because that was more horrendous than this, but that's also there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it can be disorganised. Okay. So if I was working with, I remember a very significant piece of work I did when I first started working with trauma was with a senior police officer, and he was called Dr. Death in the service because he always seemed to be on duty when there was a particular gruesome death to work with. And he had a series of, there were many, but we picked out 10 of the most horrendous things that he'd witnessed. And we worked through them in a hierarchy, starting from the least to the most traumatic. During that work, I experienced vicarious trauma. So I'd be going home at night and cooking my tea and seeing body parts floating around in the stew. So be aware of that from a therapist point of view. That's what's happening. It's vicarious trauma, which you need to deal with lots of self-care. What was my point with that? Oh yes. So we went through each thing and we relived each event, and he got through it. But that's probably not going to happen with childhood sexual abuse. I think it took so long with him because right at the end, he told me about an issue. It wasn't childhood sexual abuse, but he had, he looked a bit Italian to me, but for me, he was white. But he'd come to the UK with his mum when he was very little. And I think she might have been Italian, but at that time he was racially abused, and he was actually put in some tyres, and the tyres were set alight. So that made his journey as an adult through trauma more difficult, and that's why sometimes when people come, they're coming with an accident or something that has happened to them, and you start working on that, and then the childhood trauma comes out. So they're traumatised on a whole different level. So normally CBT exposure works quite well with those one-off incidents, and that's probably why they're managing it okay in the NHS, but then suddenly this undercurrent comes out and the root of the issue needs dealing with in a different way. because we don't want to make people go back to those childhood experiences in quite the same way that we would with accidents, and helping people to use a technique where we ask people in trauma work, not childhood sexual abuse, we ask people to use like a recorder event, and so you can fast forward it to the end, to the point in which they're in a safe place. So when they get stuck in their trauma, you fast forward it to the end, or you can rewind it, or you can stop the tape, or we use that analogy to help people work through trauma. But actually with childhood sexual abuse, where is the safe place, really? So it doesn't work in the same way. But you can use CBT to address the guilt and the shame. So we will have some CBT exercises, but to be clear, we're not using CBT exposure. Okay, so we're using CBT to help people to reframe their memories, which will have not happened at the moment. Psychoeducation, so helping people to understand the very basics of that polyvagal theory, what's happening in their body, because once people recognise there's a biological base to what's happening to them, it's easier for them to deal with it through self-awareness and associating how it feels to be in shutdown, how it feels to be in fight flight, and understanding what that's about. Are you all right to keep going? Yeah.
What time are we making? Just
11 o'clock.
Brilliant. Is that right?
Oh, we could have a, oh, I don't know if it'll be ready, but doesn't. If you're all right to carry on, we'll carry on. There's quite a lot to get through. Okay. Mindfulness, grounding techniques, helping people to stay in the present because their trauma is in the past. So when the confrontation is happening, being able to now enable somebody to return to the green by, okay, what's happening right now? Feet on the floor, arms on the chair. I'm quite safe, I'm here, you know, the walls are grey, there's no danger right now. So helping people to come out of reliving their traumatic memory. So if you see somebody slipping, enabling them to ground themselves, use mindfulness techniques, take a sip of water. I've had people take their shoes off and put their feet on the cold floor, or walk around the room just to kind of find what's dangerous in this room, just enabling people to come back out of their high alert state or their shutdown. Okay, so the most important thing is to make it a safe place and to teach people to co-regulate. When people are getting very distressed, we don't want them to stay in that distressed state because that's not helpful. We need them to see it as part of the process, but be able to come out of it. So before we start any in-depth work, there's quite a lot to do in terms of developing a relationship and making a safe place. Particularly important for survivors to be in a consistent room. That's probably another reason why NHS struggle, because rooms get booked out to all kinds of people. I know I've ended up working in a broom cupboard with somebody once.
How professional.
I know. Or I remember very vividly working with a young girl that had been physically abused by her stepfather, and her mother had never done anything about it. they're sitting in the GP surgery, and the GP comes in with a student. I said, come in. Sorry, I'm coming in. I need to get this equipment out of the room. So came in, collected the equipment and everything. I'm trying to get them out and everything. But of course, he just did that anyway. The client never came back because in that scenario, I was a mother who hadn't done anything to stop that happening. So having a safe place where you can create that safety and it's predictable, really important. Okay. There are other helpful things that people can do. So with the whole idea of attunement, I'm not suggesting that you sing with your client, but if they do community exercises outside, singing, music, it's all helping people to attune to community and to be able to understand reactions and responses. So dance, touch in some circumstances, hug, massage in the right place can be really helpful for attunement. So yoga, I guess Pilates the same. It's all about helping the person to inhabit their body and to feel in tune and in rhythm and more confident about their part in things and what comes back. And situations like drama, so Fitzpearls, he's quite, he had a lot of trauma in his background. He came from a ghetto, was Jewish, around the wartime, and he did a lot of amateur dramatics. That really helped. So getting what's inside out, being more confident in being able to express. So it's not just about what happens in the room, but it's what's happening for the person outside. So getting them involved in things, trying to encourage them to be involved in some of these things that are about inside, outside things, really important. Safe positions. So if the client feels safe in the corner, then go to the corner. If the client wants to roll up in a ball, let them roll up in a ball. If the client needs to hug a pillow, let them hug a pillow. Other things that we haven't got time to go into today, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's where the client watches a moving object, either the finger of the therapist or something on the screen. They think this works because it replicates REM, sleep process. So when you sleep, your eyes move backwards and forwards. And the person who was a psychotherapist who discovered this was she was sitting on a beach processing her own traumatic memory, and at the back of the beach there were some poplar trees, and she was watching them sway. She was thinking about the trauma, and what she realised was that was helping her to shift that traumatic memory into a normal, everyday bad memory. So we're trying to, the traumatic memory is never going to be good memory, but it can be an ordinary bad memory. Yeah. And internal family systems. So basically the theory about internal family systems is that we each carry a family of people inside of us, different parts. The part of me that was abused, the part of me that is a mother, the part of me that works, the professional bit of me, the coper, the person who dissolves. I've worked with people who've got parts that are guitars. Oh, this is the guitar part of me. That's
I'm missing that part. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because I think you are almost different people in different settings.
family systems therapy talks about the fact that we have exiles, parts of ourselves that we would rather not hear from.
Yeah.
I'm saying in the cupboard, exile, I don't want to hear from you. And then we have two types of protectors. We have the managers who try and make sure that we never get into a situation where the exile might pop out. Manages us, and that part can often be very perfectionist and very controlling. So I'm going to manage my life so this exile never comes out. And then we have firefighters who are things like drugs, alcohol, gambling. So when the feelings do come up, there are ways to deal with that. And so they can often be quite destructive. So it's an interesting concept to work out. You might come across an exile, or you might not come across an exile. You might come across a manager much more often who is trying to keep that exile suppressed. And you could ask the manager, is it okay if I speak to the exile? Let's hear what the exile's got to say. Because the idea with this, it's actually quite similar to the Saggioli psychosynthesis theory. I don't know if you remember it, with the different parts of self on the wheel. It's all about synthesizing and allowing the person to hear from the abused child. What does the abused child need to say? How can we attend to help reach out to this inner child that's exiled? So it's quite, and that workbook, I'd suggest that's for extra reading. And a very old book, I don't even know if you can get hold of that anymore, but this Rescuing the Inner Child, looking at books about inner child work, quite helpful. Okay. So I think I've mentioned all of those books now, apart from the workbooks. Right, working practically. So for the next part, it would be good for actually got 4 books, so you can have a look at them. One of them's mine. So or paper and dishwasher. Pairs of 3. That work. What's the time now? 46. Would it be right if we have an early break?
That's
that work?
Thank you.
Okay. A breather. Okay.
That was a little wonderful. Actually, I'm going to lean on this for a minute.
Grab your, keep the book. Keep the book.
Keep the book.
Keep the book. You want to, when I ask you to have a look at things, if you two do that. You 3 together.
Let's do book. We will have
To make sure that I'm taking the right one back, because I had a second-hand one that somebody had started. So if you find one that ticks in, that's fine.
Okay, no, it's not here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It smells new.
Okay.
It smells new.
So how are we doing so far? All right.
Yeah, we do. All right.
Any questions? Bearing in mind that I'm a fish fingers and chips neurologist.
I think it's kind of just really to worrying level about the dealing with the child in sexual abuse, that type of trauma, being completely different to dealing with other traumas. And I think without this training, I just wonder how many therapists would make that mistake. It's quite worrying in a way that you've got to relive the abuse. I'm going back to kind of hypnotherapy and stuff with not a lot of training. You've got people out there that are just thinking, oh well, we've got to, go back in there and revisit that trauma and really sort of scary stuff.
It's never sat with me, exposure therapy, especially because it just feels like too deep a wound to keep open without being able to put something on it so that people can really, the overt stuff with the exposure therapy. I think, being aware of how to engage so that it can be opened up rather than it being, opened up in a sort of severe way. We must do this kind of thing. It's a different approach, more person-centered, if I can say it that way, rather than it being a we must do this and never mind exposure stuff.
It works beautifully well for type 1 PTSD though.
Exposure therapy, really.
One-off traumas, car accidents,
Okay, I do.
things like that.
Okay.
Works great for that.
And maybe it's just me with an aversion to it, and that
Yeah.
can happen sometimes, can't it? It's just no, I don't think it's especially, but I understand.
Yeah.
That it could actually.
Has it's
affect
horses for courses. Sorry, what were you going to
Horses for
say?
courses.
Yeah, and I was just really kind of relieved in a way when you said about building a relationship, because I've got a few clients where I've really taught 3, 4, even 5 sessions on just building the relationship, but not wanting to jump into any CBT or anything else, but just focusing on building that relationship so that they feel safe enough to talk. Which kind of, at the time I was thinking, is this therapy? But actually it is, because they're not going to talk without that investment. So that was quite a relief to hear about.
Okay. Yeah, so bearing in mind that we're going to look at some exercises to do, but you have to have that background of the relationship and safety, and to be able to bring somebody out of their extreme distress and get them into the green rather than out in the red or amber. So thinking about that picture of the polyvagal system. So this book is actually meant for a self-help book, but actually I'm not sure about it as a self-help book, but it's really helpful for therapists. And the reason I think that it will be good when it's mediated by therapists is that you get an opportunity to work through things. So with the caveat that you've done the foundation work, here are some practical things that we can look at together. Okay, so first of all, we have to decide whether now is the right time. And to be open to the idea that now is not the right time. So if somebody's in crisis, wrong time. If they're terrified, they're about to lose their house, they're about to lose their job, maybe that's not the right time either. If they're in a domestically violent situation, perhaps not the right time to do it. Although sometimes this work could help them break out of a domestic violence situation. So it's about detecting what's the balance, what's the cost, and what's the benefit of starting the work now. If they might feel that they're too depressed to start right now, or actually they might think, I'm doing really well, I don't want to upset the apple cart. So being mindful of where the client feels about work. There's never going to be a moment where they think, whoa, let's get on with this work. But it is about understanding the balance of the timing and how it fits into their life picture at the moment. and also about what kind of messages that they are having about whether it's the right time to look at it or not. So, for example, are they in a very critical space? Are they surrounded by critical friends where they can't talk about it? What's the background? So it might have been triggered by then they might have started seeking help because of a social media thing that's going on, and then they might have come across some very specific messages from family around their reactions to what's happened in the media, so they might feel unsafe. So talking about their different groups and networks and what are the kinds of messages, but generally speaking, I think the messages around at the moment are about speaking about it.
Yeah.
But it hasn't always been the case, and I think culturally it hasn't been, and maybe is still not the case elsewhere in the world, but certainly Britain and America are grasping the ball by the horns, so to speak. Okay, so we're looking forward rather than backwards. So the messages would be, we don't look at childhood sexual abuse, that's all about the past. And actually what we need to do is think about the future. How are we going to get on in the future? So that is a kind of a message. Are you making a mountain out of a molehill? Was this really as bad as you think it was? You know, it's gone, it's in the past. It's, you know, I can't remember what was happening to me when I was 3. So why is that important for you to unpick this now? And, you know, your dad's about to die. Is it this is the right time to unpick it now? So talking about things like that might be difficult in terms of the family dynamic at the time. But actually, dad dies, and you never have an opportunity to deal with it with dad. Getting that balance right, isn't it? Doesn't mean to say that you can't deal with it in other ways. We'll look at other ways of dealing with when the perpetrator is not accessible. But it's about getting this. What's my life like at the moment? So am I juggling 3 jobs and a huge family? I'm not sure if I'm mentioning like a feeling that I get really anxious when I'm around this person. I don't really know why. Some vague memories, but I've blocked it out. So thinking about it, these are some of the messages that people might be trying to grapple with about whether now is the right time. So helping people to do that exploration about is now the right time, and being really sensitive, using counselling skills to work that out is an important backdrop as well. And so now we've got our beginning foundations. They need to feel safe, pacing, slow or speed the process. That's going to depend on the individual. Being able to distance. So sometimes when we do role plays and stuff, we brush off, physically brush off, or different people do it in different ways. They might say out loud, this is not happening to me now. I'm now an adult, I was a child. This is part of me from a long time ago. This isn't happening to me right now. I think for some people it is still happening for them. But it's about helping somebody to reduce back into that green place and getting into a good place before you let them out the door. Okay. Helping them to be able to use that psychoeducation to ground, breathe, to do all those kind of things, to step back, maybe to see their memories in black and white or grainy pictures, or if they've got an image, to be able to do some NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, where I remember I worked with a chap who brought me a picture of his baby with cigarette burns that had been done by his ex-wife's partner. I brought it in a A4 thing that he printed off, huge picture, and he just produced it. So with my vicarious trauma, in my mind's eye, I fold the picture, and I fold the picture, and I fold the picture, and I fold the picture as many times as I can until it's tiny, and then I put it aside. Because using those techniques to distance from it is quite helpful. Taking the colour out of things is quite helpful. So just taking a step back, seeing it from the outside, these are all techniques that you can use to distance from the emotion. But for some people, they need to get closer. So they've firmly put their stuff in the past, dissociated from it, and they can't relate to it. So then you might use photos, objects, focusing, EFT, emotional focus therapy, where you ask somebody to focus on their emotion. Where is it in your body? What colour is it? What does it feel like? What texture is it? So for some people, they need to be able to step away, and for some people, they need to get closer to it because they're just dissociated. Having a network of safe people outside of therapy that they can access is a good starting point as well. So making sure that they have their support structures, maybe they've got a friend that they can talk to, maybe they have a family member, maybe they can phone Samaritans or go to a support group or access some kind of a support network outside of therapy. That's helpful to have as part of the foundations. And then talking about self-care. How is this person going to look after themselves when they leave the therapy room? What are the things that help them? Do they need a deep bath? Do they need to go for a walk? Do they need to listen to music? What are those self-soothing techniques that are going to help? So I always feel a bit wary if somebody's coming at the beginning of the day and then they're going to go off to work. I'm not sure how that works. So being able to set the time of therapy, if you possibly can, at a time of day that somebody could then take an afternoon or a couple of hours just to themselves to make sure that they come down from distress. Anchoring techniques, people familiar with that? So an object that, so the police officer that I talked about, he used to, as a child, he used to go to a place in Wales, the Steps or something, and there was a river with a stony thing, so he kept a tiny little pebble in his pocket. So that was his anchoring object, and it had got happy memories of playing in the stream when he was a child. Somebody else had their safe place was their grandmother's house, and her grandmother used to wear Lily of the Valley perfume. So she went and got some Lily of the Valley perfume, sprayed it on a handkerchief. She'd keep the handkerchief in her handbag. And when she got distressed, she'd get it out, and nobody knew what she was doing, but she was smelling that perfume, which took her back to her grandmother's house, which was a safe place. So an anchor is something tangible. Could be a photograph, could be an object, could be a smell, could be a taste, a sweet or something that's comforting associations. And the anchor is the physical object that you have with you to help you to come down. Yeah, another example of that would be one of my clients had rail music that she'd play in the car or whatever it is. Could be anything. anything that helps the senses, something tangible. Okay.
So is it a brain one? Just.
Yes, it's been recording the whole time, even over break. Okay. Okay. Yeah, remember to put it on, didn't remember to turn it off. Okay. So if we have a look at the book, and I'd like you to have a look at 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3, which are the effects of sexual abuse, feelings about yourself, and the relationship with your feelings. I want you to go over those as a group and just discuss what it might be like for somebody who's coming into therapy to do one of these, and what would be the purpose of doing this at the beginning of the work, or when you start to say, let's have a look. Anybody get the page number? 30.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just have a chat about that.
It's very exposing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think
Yeah.
it might potentially be quite triggering.
I think
there's a lot
it is.
there.
I think in some ways, depending on the client, it would contribute to them.
Yeah,
They're sitting in the corner and
yeah.
taking some of it, because I think that otherwise it becomes very managerial. It's good to share the journey so that it becomes a journey. You just really there's a lot there, I'll tell you. But the other thing is, I think that intro is happiness, but a lot of people actually can't phrase what they're going through. So I think that in itself could be quite difficult for them to work through it further. A great start to the relationship. Some of these things you don't really know might relate to actually having been sexually abused.
Yeah.
You know, you may just think it's positive.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying. Yeah, of course I'm vomiting, you know, self-induced vomiting. Of course I'm doing all that. Don't relate it to the trauma. She gets really quite thick and fast, doesn't it?
I suppose it gives you a lot of information very quickly, doesn't it?
Yes,
I suppose, but I don't know, I feel like that. But then I guess I think it says a little bit later on about sometimes it can help appreciating that other people who's gone through similar have similar.
Yeah.
Really normalises it as well.
Commonality of it.
Yeah.
Other people have experienced it, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But also, as you just said, there's something on there that I just thought, oh, I hadn't thought that.
Mm. I mean, this initially, when people come in, they feel very isolated or separate from people. And so by getting these things out, it can start to have that impact. So you can't stop that happening back there. There's that sense of, shoulders might go down and be thinking, "Oh, it's not just me." Like you just said a few minutes ago. But they can feel, people can feel separate in their experience.
I wonder if there's something as well, starting to write things down as well. I know that makes it real, doesn't it?
Definitely. And that's why that relationship needs to be established with us. To be able to say, yeah, gosh, that's happened to me, not to feel quite so sure.
When would you do this?
Yeah, gosh, it's really good question. That's when one would say that each one.
I think that's okay. So there's some kind of concrete.
Yeah. Yeah.
Deeper dives like that. Yes.
Even piece of the kind of aggressive sexual behavior. What's the definition of normal sexual behavior versus aggressive?
That's what there's to know now as well.
Yeah, actually, no, that's true. I've noticed that.
Could be a habit,
Yeah.
but not right now. That might be quite positive, mightn't it? In that sense, it was already coming through some stuff, maybe.
And can go back to and revisit it because you didn't realise that it was happening to you, or maybe can't even face it right now.
I just saw that one about. I just thinking of myself, obviously not having been through this, but just think about. I think I'm one of those people who just box it off. That's how I would deal, not this situation, but situation. I think this really hard. It would be almost like acknowledging things that we not want to talk about,
Facing it.
That's not to say it's not.
To revealing to start with.
It's funny to think actually it's not really say we should do like at the beginning of the
Yeah. I think so. And that's not to do with one fast swoop.
I wonder whether when we like potentially absolutely because that's start, but I suppose that's up to them.
I think to be definitely very comfortable, it's treated just not to see maybe sometimes when people about just society, it's a bit like the conversation as well. And actually some questions there he's thinking about how would you talk about the sexuality or aggressive sex. I think I might have to say that think about something about actresses facing go home and think about and talk about that with them. So I think this is a little word. This might be over a few weeks from my writing down anyway. Certainly being led by what their faces doing, what their body language is.
Maybe.
It's just and sometimes I would have to be done in order. I think to be familiar with the list rather than feeling like it's really showing questions. Because I've looked at every one, I think it's too much.
It's a lot to think through, isn't it?
If I was on the other side of it. And then some people very list one and don't really like them, let's do the next one. Be keen to go on the journey to find out more about themselves. It's got to be like one. Face to face, to see what's going on with people.
got my eyes to be qualified, looks a little more like that we're used to.
Okay, so let's have a talk about what your thoughts are. What's the purpose of doing this not at the beginning with this, but bearing in mind we've talked about the foundations, we've talked about how to, if somebody gets upset, how to help them deal with that. So we've got a good relationship. They know about how to calm themselves. So what would be the benefits of doing this?
Gives you a lot of information.
Not just you, but also them.
Them as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Transparency, I think, for them to know that you know that they know.
Yeah.
You know, that's joint journey of, it is a journey together, it becomes, rather than it being a question and answer. So, then you know the worst of me and I can tell you a bit more of me. So it's that, revealing as you go. I think that would be the benefit.
I kind of thought of that first one as being a lot to go through, but then you just saying that then, I suppose the flip side is for them it gets a lot of information out and maybe a little bit easier than having to talk it through. I mean, I know you might talk it through, but actually I suppose there's something that might be a benefit in my favour. It's all my stuff. That's me. That's all my stuff. Yeah. Now let's work through it.
Yeah, different people, different ways.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah.
It's to understand where the client is doing his job.
Yeah.
Where they are standing. So what are the problems they are going through, how it is related, and what are things still they are going through.
Yeah.
So it's understanding more about the client, more about their emotions.
Yeah. It gives you a bit of an idea of where you need to concentrate, where you're going. It's normalizing.
Yeah.
It's taking it from right to left hemisphere of the brain.
Yeah.
Getting it out on paper.
What about if, because there's a few on there around like, I think there's drugs and alcohol, isn't there? Yeah, drugs and alcohol. If that sort of thing came up, does that put you in a bit of a quandary then in terms of if someone's got a dependency, would you sort of push is the wrong word, but push them for want of a better word at the moment, to get some support for that first?
Encourage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it wouldn't necessarily prohibit you working with them, but you would want them to make sure they've got the support to help them with that, because it could push them further into that, couldn't it? That's their coping mechanism, what you were saying about the fighting.
Yeah. So encouraging them to get additional support with alcohol management would be good. Sending them to a specialist service, unless you've got some experience of working with that yourself. But of course, if it's a strong addiction, then there'll be chemical attachments and dependencies that what started that behaviour, drinking, for example, there's then going to be a chemical dependency upon alcohol, which would be dangerous for you to stop.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So things like different alcohol organisations have different. So Aquarius, much more likely to help people reduce slowly, whereas AA is about abstinence. So thinking about what's around and helping people to work with an agency that fits for them. NHS, sometimes you can get help through NHS for alcohol dependencies. Depends how serious it is and what the habit is, but yeah. So they could have. So we don't often suggest that therapy and 2 lots of therapy at the same time are good, but working specifically on alcohol dependency, it's almost like a parallel process, because if the alcohol is is a strategy, then you stop the strategy, then the abuse will surface. So if you're not working on that, but you're working on the alcohol, then you put somebody in a bad place, really, because you're taking away their strategies, but you're not helping them deal with the root of why they're drinking in the first place. So, yeah.
Well, as a counsellor, I found it really comforting knowing that that support network is there for the client.
Yes.
So if they're midweek, some trigger because of what we talked about, I know that they've got a support network.
Yeah. Yeah, really important. So I think that's an exception to the rule of having multiple people involved with helping this individual. Okay, so how do we express? So going back to the idea of the brain dealing with things differently, so the language centre tends to shut down a bit, and the visual part of the brain, the images part of the brain is active. Then talking, pace of talking, tone of talking, really important. Not too fast, making sure that you're giving people a chance to think about what you're saying, slowing it down is usually very helpful. Drawing, painting, writing, sculpting, bullet points, recording would be helpful. Getting them to record, audio recording, sand tray, practical things can be really helpful to be able to express some of this stuff. Mood boards, yeah.
Can I ask that question? I think
No
it's
questions
because
at
I'm not creative in the least. When you say drawing and painting, is that what would they be drawing and painting like? Is that
They could just
what
do
comes to mind, or
yeah, they could do a
memory, or
blob on the page.
just how they feel, almost,
Yeah.
whatever they feel led to do.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And I do, not necessarily in the session,
Mhm.
but for them to do.
Yeah.
And often they'll have a hobby, like just encouraging them to keep them
Expressing,
yeah.
I used to have a client that had a soundtrack for however he was being.
That's interesting. That I can relate to a little bit
Yeah.
more, actually. Yeah, that's
They had different tracks, there's different, you know, on your app, you can sometimes get different playlists.
Yeah.
They had different playlists for different purposes. So using that right brain and understanding that the right brain is activated, and then trying to bring it over into, which is another reason why those psychometrics are quite helpful as well, because you're bringing right brain into the left hand hemisphere, which enables some kind of control and logic over something that can be very ethereal and difficult to grasp hold on. Okay, so Finkler had this understanding of abuse. Right? So traumatic sexualization, too much for the age, could be painful, even enjoyable, and can lead to confusion, phobias, sex addiction, obsessions. Okay. Stigmatization, so you've got these four different things: stigmatization, blame, shame, secrets, feeling dirty, can lead to people isolating themselves, and low self-esteem, no respect for self or their safety. So you could perhaps see people engaging in very risky behaviours. I worked with somebody that used to go to lay-bys and go and sit in cars with people, you know, so it can be like that. Just really risk-taking behaviours because they have no regard for themselves and their own safety. Betrayal, being betrayed, those who are supposed to care haven't. So they might have a sense of loss, grief, depression, anger, hostility, lack of trust, independencies, numbing their emotions and feelings, sense of powerlessness. I can't stop this. So that can lead to panic and anxiety, phobias, running away. So these are all your anxiety symptoms, controlling behaviours, eating disorders, that kind of thing. Obsessions and compulsions, even aggression. So we have to understand what's going on for this particular person, and through listening to them, we need to understand which of these are most active and what caused them. So for some people, their traumatic sexualization is there's going to be a lot of guilt and shame around the fact that they had an orgasm or an erection, something like that. And so it's very confused because although it was too much too soon, they enjoyed that experience, which can be very difficult for people. So of course we know that sexual abuse can happen not just through physical contact, but recently somebody that I was working with, her mother had a series of different partners. She was never sexually abused by any of the partners, but she used to hear her mother having sex downstairs, and she used to sit at the top of the stairs and feel worried for her mother. And then she used to shout, "Mama, Mama," and her mum used to run upstairs wearing something or wearing nothing. So that would be an example of a traumatised sexualisation, although she was never actually touched herself. Other people have been exposed to materials, videos, pornography, too much too soon. And so all of those things can come into the traumatic sexualisation, but understanding how that relates to the current symptoms. So you've got a list of things that through your psychometrics now, you can start to see where some of those things come from. So it's important for us as therapists to get a feeling for what's caused what's the root of what, because they might not have any idea about why. So for example, this client had no idea why she found sex with her husband difficult, but that was because for her, the fear of what was happening to her mother was about what men do to women during sexual encounter. So although that hadn't happened to her, she'd had vicarious trauma about that. And her sexual relationship was, she endured sex with her husband. So, which is very difficult for him, who actually had been traumatically sexualised through a friend's dad's collection of pornography videos when he was 8. So both of them, neither of them physically sexually abused, but still traumatic sexualisation. Stigmatisation, betrayal. So when mum's known about it, so one of the examples in the book is that mum got a 13-year-old to have an abortion that was probably either her brother's or her father's child. And nobody ever knew. She didn't know what she was going for when she went to have the abortion. And she was handed over to medical treatment, and then she was kind of kept away from the rest of the family, kept away from school. I thought, "Well, do that, betray." Powerlessness. So understanding how that fits in, helping client to see this is happening for you now, these are the roots, what you're experiencing is a normal response to what happened, which shouldn't have happened. So helping the client to understand is a really important part of the process. And now you've got all your background information to help put together the picture. And after the psychometric test at the beginning, you can then really start to understand the picture of what happened and why the response is like it is. So I think we've covered some of this, that people distract themselves. One of my clients used to count the spots on the wallpaper while she was being raped by her father. So she'd start in the corner and she would count the spots on wallpaper. Other people go to another place in their head, dissociate from what's happening, or actually just are not present. They're not anywhere in particular, but they're not present in their experience. Alcohol, substances, food, or to detract from, I feel terrible, let me go eat cream cake, chocolate, whatever it is, to be eating or not eating, and that buzz that people get when they're really hungry. Keeping busy. Perfectly tidy house. I used to wonder about my old neighbour who used to sit in the back of his Ford Fiesta and clean all the sills with a toothbrush every week at the same time. And what's going on with that? No, there were other things as well, but yeah, keeping busy. Sleeping, let's just get away from consciousness. Not so good if you have nightmares, but some people sleep to escape, self-harming. Okay, so these are some of the things that help you with helping the client understand what happened, how they're responding, and what strategies they're using to deal with how they're feeling. Because if they don't have a clear understanding of that, they won't be understanding why you're saying, why don't you go and get help with your alcohol, because actually that's helpful, so why should they do something about that? You know, understanding that they're perfectly clean and tidy house and the compulsion that they have to keep everything tidy is to do with feeling powerless. Because they were powerless. It's helpful for people to understand why they're doing the things that they do. And people will go, I didn't really understand, I didn't appreciate what that was all about. So that in itself is really empowering for people to understand why they do, and then they don't give themselves such a hard time for the fact that they've got a problem with alcohol and substances or cleaning, or they get really ratty when somebody moves the pillow or leaves a piece of Lego on the floor or comes in the house with muddy feet, or why their temper just goes. So they get to understand stuff, you know. And then to help somebody, I think this is one of these exercises in the book. It's a bit like the CBT thought record, where they realise when they drink alcohol, how it helps them and what's the downside. So this is a very CBT technique. You know, when I cut why do I cut? It relieves tension, distracts me from emotional pain. But actually the downside of this is scars and embarrassment. So this is a way of helping clients to, can you see what exercise? I've got to put it on there.
It's on page 52.
52. Yeah. So you could prepare this in advance from some of the psychometrics and helping people to understand what is happening. So when they clean, they're distracting themselves and they've got a sense of control and achievement. Oh, because we're being tidy. That's making me feel good inside because I'm in control.
Can I just ask a question on that slightly off topic, which is on the crediting?
Yeah.
Because that seems to be coming up more and more just with people generally.
Yeah.
Is this a way, would this be something that would be helpful to people anyway?
Yeah.
To do? I'm never quite sure what to do to help someone on that sort of thing.
Yeah, helping them to understand
Why they're doing it.
why they're
And
doing
see if they
it.
can,
Yeah. So
that it's a distraction from their own
Yeah.
actual thing.
So all of these techniques, these ideas about psychometric tests, because of course if you've got a starting point and then you come back to it at the end and you look at all the symptoms and the person can see, I was like that at the beginning and now I'm like that.
Yeah.
It's like a record, isn't it? And this is the part of CBT that's really helpful to use because it's taking it from right to left hemisphere and it's helping people to understand and put some meaning and some understanding around what is a very chaotic experience, because don't forget we're talking about that polyvagal theory and how confusing it is, and attachment and all of that. Putting some understanding around that is the basics of people being able to confront their shame and their thoughts about, am I responsible? You know, why do I drink? Why do I clean? Why do I cut? So this part is, once you've set the relationship and you've got the safe place, you're working on an understanding by formulating and helping people to understand their strategies. And, you know, we go at the pace of the client. So I was listening to you guys saying perhaps we would do the psychometric by talking about it, talking it through verbally. For some people, that's going to be really helpful. Doing it, that's why I think this book is much better worked through with therapists, because as a therapist you can pick up the cues, you can see where people are, whether they're shutting down, whereas if they're doing it on their own and they dissociate, who knows how long they'll be dissociated for. Yeah. But it gives the same kind of benefits when you do it with somebody, because you can be there to help them to ground, remind them about their techniques, anchoring, etc. Okay, so we're categorising the different strategies that people are using. So harmless, they might use art, drawing, dancing, listening to music, that will be harmless. Harmless in moderation, the cleaning stuff and your distraction techniques, and generally harmful or problematic. So helping people to categorise their different strategies, and then encouraging the harmless list. And they might ask other people, what do you do when you feel like you need to feel better? Have hot chocolate and wrap myself in a duvet. Oh, that sounds like a nice idea. Or whatever it is. Making a diary, a journal, that can be helpful. We know that's helpful generally in therapy anyway, but really good for working with child sexual abuse. Substituting harmless things. So instead of cutting, you've got your elastic band for people who want to do that kind of thing, or doing less harmful things. Could even be, you know, if somebody cuts with a razor blade and they can't stop cutting, then use one that's in a holder, because then you can't accidentally cut too deep. You know, like in a shaving razor. So we're not taking away strategies, but we're trying to make them less dangerous. And cutting on the outside, although that's more obvious, is much less dangerous than cutting on the insides of legs or arms. So, yeah, keeping it clean.
Are there like helpful support groups for things like that? Because sorry, I know I'm harping on about it, it's in my head at the minute. Because obviously a lot of teenagers and young people who talk to other people who just give them ideas basically. Are there like organisations?
Yeah.
There are, like
Papyrus. Most youth organisations will work with self-harm. I don't know if there's anything locally. But I would do a stop technique with them. But we need to perhaps talk about that on a different day. So, you know, a lot of people do multiple cuts, and getting them to do one cut and counting, and then another cut, and then it's just, you know, you could cut down the amounts of cuts from 50 to 1 or 2. So we're talking about being gradual, being compassionate, noticing, not beating themselves up when they slip back into old habits, but noticing a sense of achievement if they've managed to reduce it. But no kind of punitive, self-punitive behaviour if they don't manage it. And congratulating the small wins. I only cut 40 times instead of 50 times. That's a win. And remembering that this is a survival strategy that we're dealing with here. So we're not stripping it away quickly. And what we've already talked about, seeking help with addictions. Okay, so these are our extreme emotional states: panic attack, depression, rage, floods of tears, flashbacks, hallucinations. Panic attack, it's really helpful for people to understand what's happening in their body. Panic attack. And of course, that goes for all kinds of anxiety conditions, not just depression. It's important to look at some of the strategies to deal with depression, whether it's caused by childhood sexual abuse or not. And you can use general things that you can use for anger management and all of those things. And the things that you use for hallucinations and flashbacks are the same that you use for things when people are having psychotic episodes, but it's just adding these into the toolbox when you understand what this specific presentation is about and why this person is responding like they are. So, you know, not all self-harm is caused from childhood sexual abuse, but you can borrow stuff from all of those different interventions that are going to be able to help. But some people don't, you know, they don't realise they're having a panic attack, they think they're having a heart attack, or so how can
I
people
phoned an ambulance for someone having a panic attack once because I thought they were having a heart attack. They collapsed and the lips were going blue.
Yeah.
It was really scary.
Yeah.
It's the first time I'd seen it in that extreme.
So identifying triggers is an important thing. So what starts my, whether it's the flashback, the hallucination, the panic attack, the depression, what's the trigger? Often the trigger can come through those senses, or it could be phrases or words that people use. It could be, I'm not going to hurt you. That could be a trigger. So when they go to hospital and somebody says that to them, I'm not going to hurt you. Well, that could be a trigger for a panic attack. And they might not understand why they're in hospital and somebody says, I'm not going to hurt you. Why is that a trigger? Until they realise where that comes from. Right, that's what my brother used to say. Well, that's what my dad used to say. Well, that's what my mum used to say. As we've already discussed, smells, sexual behaviours. So the client that I mentioned earlier, or sexual contact with her husband reminded her of. That was a trigger for her to kind of start associating with being panicky. Clothes, colours, certain materials. Overalls, could be anything that's and people might not necessarily be aware of what it is. So one of the most interesting, not to do with childhood sexual abuse, but to do with an accident, some days this chap used to come out of his bedroom and he just used to have it coming out of the bedroom, he used to have a trigger and he would go back into his trauma. And it took us a while to understand what the trigger was. And it was on a sunny day, if the sun was streaming through the window, it reminded him of the spotlight that was over while they're cutting out of his car that he had an accident in. And that was his trigger. So understanding sometimes takes a bit of unpicking. Why that particular trigger. And he was completely not aware of that. So the body remembers, whether it's smell or any of those five senses that are triggered, the body remembers, but you might not be aware. Because when that was happening, the person might have dissociated, but the body knows that. The body knows what's going on. Places, people, situations, somebody else in the role that the abuser was in the role of, minister, a coach, a teacher. So if somebody that was the abuser had a particular role, there might be a real reaction to that group of people. The weather. So, for example, the lady that I mentioned earlier that was raped in the autumn, as soon as the weather started and the trees started rustling with those crispy leaves and the smells of autumn, she would be most prone and hate going out because of that connection. Particular tastes. Yeah, what's tea? Granddad used to abuse me. Nakedness, music, media reports, could be anything. Okay, but client needs to understand what their triggers are for those emotional states, the panic or the hallucinations or what starts that. And understanding what the trigger is a really powerful way for them to take control of it. So helping them in other exercises in the book, helping people to just log it down. So they might log down what's happened on what day and what the trigger might have been. And that might not be clear, but over a period of time, you might be able to work out what it is. So, for example, I noticed that that the client was more likely to have been triggered when the weather was nice, I thought, I wonder, I wonder if it's about what he's wearing, or and sometimes it did happen in the winter as well. It took us ages to work out what it was. It was the sun through the window. And it wasn't until he recognised that he recognised other times that when there was a bright light, he struggled. Like when he went to have his eyes looked at, shine a light into his eyes. That was also traumatic. But then it was just a really strange panic attack that seemed to come out of nowhere, but it wasn't coming out of nowhere. So then as soon as he realised it was the light that was doing it, then whenever he knew he was going to be in a situation where there was a light, the sun was bright, or he was able then to manage and speak to himself. Okay, amygdala, you don't have to tell me to overreact here. I'm quite safe. And so he was able to almost parent himself through the trigger. So we're still helping the client to understand their symptoms at this point. So here's just some things that help people. So I think we've looked at a lot of those ones. This one, sometimes writing on a card. My name is Deb. I am 53 years old. I live at, I've got 4 children. It's my job, helping people to orientate to who they are. And maybe sometimes they just need to get the card out and just go through, okay, this is who I am. Just helping them ground in the here and now. So helping clients to work out what's happened, what they do, what triggers their anxiety, what they can do with that. So we're kind of preparing, we've done the foundations, and now we're starting to prepare a safe place from which to look at deeper things. When people have flashbacks, naming what it is, I'm having a flashback, it's really helpful. So it sounds really basic, but if people can say to themselves and to other people that they're with, I'm having a flashback, that makes a lot more sense to the people that they're with and also to themselves. Because a flashback is when you re-experience it. But if you can get to the point where you can identify, this is not really happening, I'm having a flashback, it's a memory. So that might sound really basic, but saying that is important. The worst is over. I've already experienced that, it's gone. This is just a memory. Breathing slowly, grounding yourself, reminding yourself, okay, I am an adult survivor. I've survived. I'm now an adult. I'm not a child anymore. I'm not powerless anymore. After the flashback, rest. Understanding why rest after flashback is important. Write down flashback. Okay, I had a flashback on Tuesday. This is what triggered it. It's helping people to learn and understand what could I do differently next time.
It's emotional intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah.
Hallucinations. So this is when you're actually living with something. So throwing something can be really helpful. Obviously nothing hard and heavy. So a scrunched up piece of paper. It's just doing something physical into the environment that is not part of the hallucination. Try and touch what you see, because then you'll see what it's there. Nobody shakes hands with their hallucination. Work out where the smell's coming from. Oh, I can smell that. Oh, it's not actually, it's somebody sprayed that in the toilet. Okay, this is not my abuser. Or I can smell soil because I'm gardening, not because I've been thrown down in the dirt. Music reason, so often hallucinations don't grow old. Actually, I'm seeing my dad abusing me, but actually he's 30 in this hallucination, and I know that he's now 70 or dead. So you use, but these are the same things that you do with somebody who's having a psychotic episode. If you feel like you've got something moving under your skin, you might ask somebody, can you see anything moving under my skin? And also reminding yourself that this is a familiar hallucination. I've seen this before, this is a familiar situation, it's not really happening now. And deeper, what is this hallucination doing for me? What do I need from it? What is this speaking to me about? Is this my body reminding me that I'm traumatized and I need to address this situation? So, but this is a reflection afterwards. What is the hallucination doing for me? So it might be a conflict. So hallucination might be a safety figure that comes along and saves. So it might not be a traumatic hallucination, it might be a helpful one that people are conjuring up to make themselves feel safe. Still not helpful to have hallucinations.
No.
Okay. How would you do we need another break? All right.
I could do 5 minutes.
I think, yeah.
Yeah,
Five
fine.
stretch legs and whatever.
Yeah,
Mind dress.
Yeah.
There's a lot
Mind
to take
dress.
in. It's very interesting that there's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh. No, I don't want to complain about the church, but I don't find these seats very comfortable. They're the same. The old ones, I've got the old ones with more cushions, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm just getting older there.
Well, we
I do
all
want to
are.
bring the cushion everywhere, don't I? For my ducky bit, but I feel like you can't bring the cushion to church. But I think I might get into that stage. Just bring my cushion.
The church we go to at the moment has pews. So
Oh no, I wouldn't. My pride wouldn't. I wouldn't have a problem there. I'd bring my cushion in. In there, do you find that, or is it just me? Might just be me. I've got quite a lot of padding as well, so it's not
I was in a pylon yesterday. Somebody fell, and I went to catch them. Fell on the floor. I was such a good cushion for them.
They bounce. They bounce.
Yeah, they bounce.
You were wounded.
Yes.
Is it safe to walk through here? It's not quite it.
Yeah, they won't get.
Very altruistic, isn't it?
Very.
Altruistic, me keeping my weight on to just to be there as a cushion for others.
It's really good stuff. I've been doing a lot of compassion focus therapy with quite a few clients. And a lot of this is cool.
Good.
Yeah. Scary stuff as well, isn't it? Disturbing, like,
Yeah.
I'm doing, right?
Yeah. I have done starting to feel lightheaded.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm feeling a bit hungry, I think, it's my, a little enough with me, says.
Yeah.
It's a very uneven pants, aren't they? They don't need washing.
There's another thing that I wanted to show. This month's.
Oh, yes, I thought I'd learned that when you were talking about something that came, I can't remember which bit it was, and I thought, sure, I just read something about that. Was it about re-traumatizing?
Maybe there's this using the cushion to deal with shame.
Oh, okay. That's good.
We are on slide 35 of 44. So
Okay,
we're getting there. Whoop, whoop.
it's good stuff. That. It's really interesting because last time we just going through what this means, how the brain and how our body and how these things are interacting
Yeah.
in this situation.
Yeah.
That's really very interesting. And I'm doing, I've just been doing some courses from that work that get sent emails with LinkedIn courses on well-being.
Mm.
And a lot of it has been about dealing with overwhelm and about mindfulness and
Yeah.
and how the body and the brain are connected. 80% of communication goes from the body to the brain,
Yeah.
and then 20% from the brain to the body. Or I could just assume it was can your brain tell you what you want to do? And that was really interesting.
Your brain filters out most of the messages that you get most of the time. So, you know, you're sitting on a chair now, you know exactly which parts of your body are touching the chair, but completely unaware of it. And there's a sound in the background, and
Yeah.
we filter out most of that stuff that's coming because it's not novel. To focus on the little bit that's important for us at the time. Yeah, just couldn't cope, could we? We were processing all of the information all of the time. Just couldn't cope.
What is amazing? You need to see that picture of all the nerves, don't you?
Yeah.
So complicated. There's nothing can go wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, I wonder if some of it's connected to people like with autism and having overwhelming
Just like
sensory.
Yeah, maybe they're just not so good at filtering out what's unnecessary.
I've been watching something like with a man with autism, very clever, one almost, is it stubborn or like absolutely brilliant, but what I found interesting is that he, a bit like you were saying, remembers things by smell, and I'd never really come across that, but like that's how he associates things, and I never really thought about it like that. When you have different people's minds and things work, their senses work.
The same emotions and feelings for some people. They associate more with colour or something, but if you ask them to describe the feeling, they might not be able to put a word to it. if you ask them what colour they think, some people just look at them like,
That's interesting.
but for them, that's how they relate more to colour.
Photosynthesis. What do they call it? They don't call it photosynthesis. It's chronosynthesis.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
So that's where the colour wheel comes into it, the emotion, that colour wheel of emotion.
But there's a word for it when people put colour to things.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it? Because if you don't think that way, until you come across someone, it sounds so stupid, but until you come across someone who does, I would never, I don't associate things with colour, but
But they might not know that they think that. way.
Yeah,
They
that's
might just
it,
think
until-
they can't express emotion, but once you put it to them, they do it, oh,
that's how
and it's that normalising. Then, oh, okay, I do feel emotion.
that's something, isn't it?
Because it's not your second.
Because they live with it, don't they?
Yeah, but they haven't been able to put words to it because no one said to them. They come to them,
It's great. Kids, is it up to this one? The many coloured days.
oh, is that?
Yeah.
I think we should have that in the library.
Yeah, because it talks about, you know, it's a red day. Some days I feel yellow and I'm bouncing around, other days I feel blue. I'm sure it's called my many coloured days. Yeah, it would be good for, it would be good at different stuff.
Remember when Naomi was little, she said to me, she was about 3 or 4, she said, I feel a bit grey today. Well, I know exactly how you feel.
Yeah, it just, it's, now you say it, when you said about yellow as well, and fancy rain, you know exactly what storm means, don't you? When you, and a red day, you think it's sort of an angry day. So actually, you do know exactly what, it's actually quite a good way of expressing it, isn't it?
And languages, because if I said to you it's a red letter day, what does that mean? Doesn't necessarily mean angry, but it might mean something else.
It's true.
An important day. Something that sticks out like an important message, or it could be danger, or it could be anything, really. Okay, so distorted beliefs. You'll know that CBT is good for working with distorted beliefs. So another way of using CBT. What do children believe? So helping them to see perhaps that their views of their sexual abuse, what they think I'm responsible for. So a child will have certain beliefs. So based on the fact that they need their parents to look after them, I have to comply, I have to do as I'm told, whatever that is. Then if somebody was to take them out of that and say, okay, let's imagine, have you got a child that's near to you, maybe a niece or a nephew or a next door neighbour, that's the same age that you were when you were being sexually abused. Do you think that child deserves that? So you show them the difference between their childlike belief and what they would believe now as an adult. Yeah. So the client might believe, this is another client that I had, that he was insufficient, inferior, not good enough because his mum was always too busy for him. Okay, so when I talk to him about a parent who's always busy, is that because the child is insignificant, inferior, not worthy of attention? No, that's, as an adult, he knew that was the mother's issue. But internally, his child was still stuck in the place. It was his issue. So comparing the beliefs of a child with the beliefs of an adult is really an important thing to do, helping somebody to come out of what they really believe and they're stuck in, and being able to see that from a third person perspective as an adult, because you can appeal to the adult in them. And of course, they know that these things are wrong. But that inner child is still stuck with their belief. Third person perspective. So if they can't think of themselves as a child, they might be able to see it for the child next door, or their niece or their nephew, or their own child, or whatever it is. Helping people to understand, children to understand the power imbalance of a parent or a teacher or a minister or a priest, or how are they different in terms of power? So unpicking what power does a teacher have? What power does a parent have? So think about a parent, they're bigger, stronger, they're the provider. Anything else? Knowledge. Yeah. Language. Manipulation.
There's that conditional love as well attached to it all, isn't there? So
Yeah.
that's how the child wants that affection and love.
Actually, unpicking that's really quite helpful, because lots of people who have endured childhood sexual abuse, that part of them is kind of frozen in time, and the beliefs are stuck there with the child, and they haven't kind of grown up with the person, which is the good thing about rescuing the child. Helps to pick out those differences, and the difference between what was happening when they were a child as compared to their beliefs now as an adult. Thinking about the blackmail side of things. So the client who notices that she can actually make everything all right for the rest of the family, because dad's happy when she's getting abused, and mom doesn't get hit, and the brother doesn't get the belt. So this is her part, and she knows that dad's in a much better place when she allows that abuse to happen.
Such responsibility for a child to start thinking.
Yeah. So helping the adult survivor to see themselves not just from the inside, but to see themselves as a child is key. How is this going to affect those distorted beliefs? So we're not reliving the trauma, but we're helping somebody to understand that the beliefs that they hold about themselves at the moment are distorted by a number of different things. And understanding these through some of the exercises in the book are really helpful. You know, what are children afraid of? Abandonment, not being loved, not being heard, not being valued, pain, isolation. So being aware that a child has more need to fear these things. You know, if the abuser used to feed the child and the child's in a neglecting parental home, so parents might be neglecting the child, and the neighbour might say, come round for a meal, or come round, let's watch a movie together. So it's different ways of, you know, come and look at the kittens, or come and look at the puppies, or whatever it is. It's always playing on a need, a childhood need, and helping the adult to see what needs the abuser was manipulating is important. So why might it have been difficult for this child to tell mum what was happening when they're 4, 5, 6?
No language to do
No language.
And they've no filter to know that they're being manipulated. It's what they want to do is to look at the kittens or whatever it needs to be. So they're led by their need. And then there's a guilt maybe comes into it as well. Shouldn't really go down there.
It's my fault I showed my knickers.
Indeed, yeah, concentric view, it's got to be my fault.
They might not have the words, they might not be able to describe. And then going back to the idea that when in trauma, our language centre is shut down, you've got somebody who's not used to using vocabulary to talk, plus what's happening in their body. They just might not know where to start. You know, they might be talking about somebody who's a powerful figure, who's respected in the community, or the football coaches, you know, this person has the power to put me through to the next match or not. Or there's so many different manipulations that children have experienced. But helping them to understand why they didn't tell is really important, why they might not have told. And the other thing is that sometimes they tell and they're not believed. Less so now. That's been a lot in the past. What would the child be feeling? So it could be a mixture of, you know, I'm so neglected at home. I do want to go to the neighbour's house and watch something on the telly because that's fulfilling the need for me. And this other bit comes with it, but actually this is a package deal and I really want to do this or play on a game or see these little kittens or to have some adult take some attention, some time with me, makes me feel special, all of those kind of things. So helping the adult to understand what their child needed and why they didn't speak up is a really important part of this process to help them deal with that distortion, unpicking, you know. And for some children, they don't understand, you know, as a child, somebody might say, oh, he used his tail on me, because they don't understand what a penis is.
Yeah.
They don't really understand what's happening.
Yeah.
So it could be a lack of understanding of what's actually going on. How do you verbalise that to somebody if you don't really understand the process that's happening? And why would somebody believe me as opposed to the teacher or the parent or I'm just a child? Okay, so we're starting to work on now. I hope you can see that we're getting a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
But it's a gradual process, and that's what it really needs to be: gradual building on things. Responsibility cake. So I couldn't find a different, but trying to help people to understand where they are at what they think. So who do they think is most responsible? So they might think that it's equal. They might think that they have a bigger slice of the cake of responsibility. It's really my fault because I led that person on, or I enjoyed that, or I was asking for that, or it's my fault. So they might start to, they might think something, but they might feel something different. So getting them to do their thinking map and their feeling map. So they might be able to think, actually, I was a child, so it wasn't my fault. And they might have a thinking cake, responsibility cake with themselves as a much smaller slice, but they might feel hugely responsible. So helping them to separate out, what do I think, what do I feel? And then there's all these different exercises, which we probably haven't got huge amounts of time to have a look at. But if you wanted to go back over it, all the exercises there relate to, you know, there's some drawing techniques. Let's draw the abuser. So what page is that one? So this is an example in the book. So it's page, I think what that says, 98. So they might do a picture where they put their the adult that's abusing, and the child on page 98, but then the feeling might be page 99. Yeah. So it might have a much bigger feeling about the power of this person, the strength of this person, but they might actually be able to think a little bit more rationally. But you're dealing with the inner child, and the inner child is more of a feeling than a thinking being. Yeah. So just helping people to understand the power that the person has, whether it's a drawing, whether it's language, talking it through. We've already talked about drawing can be helpful. And then you've got these other exercises, 5.6, 5.7. Shall I just give you 5 minutes to flick through those and have a look at them?
Oh, thank you. That was an incredible one on month 6. Why I couldn't tell. Yeah.
Having these things written down is really important for people to be able to go back to some of this at a later date.
Yeah. I think this format is good to continue through the book. And then it becomes a familiar one, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So as you think about it differently each time with each subject. It's a good format.
It's a really powerful one, isn't it? Believing you're the only one who's ever because that really increases all that shame, guilt, feeling of emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm uniquely bad.
this phrase normalised keeps coming up, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's time and time again. Feelings and emotions, thoughts. Yeah.
Shouldn't be normal, should it? But
No.
yeah, other people have gone through it.
Yeah. And if we're not careful, people will start to minimise.
Mhm.
But they've gone through things, well, they have as well, so it can't be that bad. In actual fact, that work to actually get into their life,
Mm.
for them to feel that, you know, it wasn't their fault.
Mm.
It's really important. You know, one client in particular who minimises everything, just scary.
Yeah.
You know, there isn't that reality of what they have gone through.
Mm.
Children.
Because actually the adult will have given that message. This is okay. This is normal.
Yeah.
It's like really normalising, isn't it? And I think it's only when I read that list and seen that in that list of confusion, you know, that I realised then that what that normalising is about. That actually they're not being real people. Rather than making it sound like, oh, it's okay, it's normal, you can talk about. And actually that realisation is in it. They're not understandable.
That's right.
So I want punishing between
Yeah.
symptoms. It's not like who's doing that. He's free and he's taking all the blame and all the things on stress on us, and it's really not good. Actually.
Mm.
And that's the child.
Do you get many female abusers?
Yeah.
Is it more or less similar?
It can be even worse for people who have experienced abuse from females because females are supposed to be more nurturing. And so that must mean they're particularly bad.
Yeah.
It makes you so sad with those.
The ratio of girls and boys, is it same?
It's hard to say because boys are much less likely to come forward and say something about it.
What was that? Hopefully getting better,
Yeah.
but it's still different, isn't it?
Mm.
It's still, it was interesting that, or it intrigued me that MP that got stepped down, which was fun. That was an abuse against men, wasn't it? Which was, it's not very often you hear that. In most of the cases.
I know I felt actually with the growth of the women, they would have really upset.
Yeah. It was quite interesting that I thought it was probably a good thing that, not that it happened, but that they were open about that, because actually you don't hear about that so much. All the Me Too and stuff generally. And then on women, I think was probably a lot there.
I found that fascinating, or horribly fascinating, I suppose, that somebody had remembered that he'd done the same to them 15 years ago. And that once again was a memory that had been hidden by another guy who was groped twice by him. And he had forgotten about it until hearing it in the press. And, thought he would also get in touch. It's given weight, really. It's real scenario.
But it also, he was really angry that, like, how many years have these abusers doing things?
Boys often feel emasculated by it as well. I should have been strong enough. There's a case study in the book which talks about a boy that was sexually abused by his grandmother, and he was singled out. But he allowed it to go on until he was about 18 or 19, when he was much stronger than his grandmother, but he allowed it to go on. So lots of guilt around that, and why did I allow that to go on for so long? But understanding when that started and how that progressed was really important for that person. So this next stage is looking at the abuser, which we need to be quite in a good place with the client to look at this. So back to Finkler, he says that there are 4 steps before abuse occurs, which is something that the client might not even have thought about. That there has to be a person that wants to abuse in the first place. That person has to overcome thoughts that abusing is wrong. So they might know it, but their desire to fulfill a need is stronger. So they've overcome or excused, or I love this person, or this child is driving me mad, or whatever it is, whatever level of excuse that person has, it has become stronger than their belief that what they're doing is wrong. They've allowed it to overtake. And then the abuser has to get the child alone to do this abuse. And then the abuser has to overcome the child's resistance. So to actually think about that is helpful for clients. Why? Horrible for clients, but why is it helpful for them to think about these things?
Because it's not coming from them, it's coming from the other person. Like they didn't entice or make it happen as a child.
Yeah. 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 So it didn't just happen by accident. Which then, when all the blame's been put on the child, this is a real helpful counterbalance, because this is intentional from an adult, it's predatory. And they probably won't even have thought about any of those things. We're getting into territory now where we have to be careful that the client doesn't think that we are normalising sexual predatory behaviour. But sometimes it's helpful to understand the abuser. Particularly if they've got a relationship with this person. So I've certainly worked with people whose dad is still alive. There was sexual abuse. They had to somehow rub along with him, you know, have a day-to-day relationship with this person that they love. To understand what took them down that road. Dad was abused by his dad. Doesn't make it right, and this is what we have to be clear about. Just because this happened and you can understand why it happened doesn't make it excusable. And so making sure that the tone of how we do this is not excusing the person, but understanding is quite helpful.
Like, I mean, even me, not in this position, reading that feels really uncomfortable because I really wouldn't want to go there. I guess you've already said about being in the right place for it, but I can just feel like my own instinct would be, I don't want to think about what's going on in that person's head. So I think and other people, I suppose what my question is, are there people where you wouldn't go there because you can see that's going to be
because sometimes it's totally irrelevant as well, but when this is a family member and you've got a decision about whether you're still in a relationship with them or not, sometimes it helps to go there. Because there's a balance to be had there. And particularly some of these exercises you go over with the non-abusing parent as well. So
Oh, that's an interesting.
You know, you might look at why did mum not say anything, or if it's dad, why did dad not say what was happening? Yeah.
Yeah.
So understanding the profile of why somebody might have done something when the relationship is ongoing. So this is why it's really important for you as a therapist to understand what's going to be helpful for the client. You can pick out of the book rather than doing a one-size-fits-all. So understanding why somebody raped you at knife point, there's no benefit in that.
No, yeah,
But-
I understand what you're saying, and I think also it's probably there's an element of my own personality in there, and it would cut them off. But obviously, yeah, that's a different people in having to deal with that relationship on their own. That's a totally different problem.
Some people are in a position where they're now caring for an elderly parent that abused them when they were children. Understanding that's right. I can't. My batch is going to be quite no idea.
10 to 1.
10 to 1. So you've got a little bit of time. Just seen Nathan earlier. Okay, so we're on slide 40 and 44 now. Nearly there. Keep going. Good. Okay, so then we've got stubborn guilt. So somebody might have rationalised why they feel like that, but they still might have an overriding sense of guilt. And this might be a sense of guilt that they've carried for years and years and years. It's not going to go overnight. So that's why it's helpful to have these things written down. Sometimes people have to go back to what they've written down. They have to start to change their feelings by dealing with that inner child, seeing themselves as a child. When new things come up, reframing it, going back to unpicking those distorted beliefs, using their strategies, bringing their level of distress down with their polyvagal system. So, but guilt can be stubborn. So going back over some of these things is really important. Why do I still feel guilty? There's a good in this month's diversity. There's a section there about using cushions to deal with shame and anger. So it gives you some examples in the book. Do you want to have a quick look at 6.7 to 7.5?
One jump vibration. One jump.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Just have a quick flick through.
What to take.
Looking at things like no send letters, speaking to an empty chair, all of those things really helpful. Borrowing from Gestalt techniques.
That must be hard actually. Why was I the only person?
Yeah.
Like if you're in a family, that must be really difficult as well.
If I wasn't the only one, then I'd have somebody to talk to about it, and we could make sure, you know, it's much more likely that the perpetrator is going to be found. When if nobody else in the family has experienced what that one child has experienced, then there's no validation to it.
I literally feel it's
Yeah.
it's really depressing to think that it's still a really commonplace.
It's that predatory behaviour, isn't it? That whole calculated almost. This is how I'm going to do it. Almost just like knowing what you're doing.
It's like an animal, isn't it? Picking on the weak.
Yeah.
Well,
But almost worse because it's that planning,
yeah.
that process of
Because a predator has to eat. People
Yes,
don't have
that's
to
true.
sexually
Yeah, no, that's
abuse.
absolutely true. Yeah. Sure. I'm glad you left it to people. Quite very choosy.
Obviously, you'll have a chance to use the book and go over things.
Can we have could you send the slides to us as well?
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite tiny on
It's a
here,
bit
aren't they?
difficult to read on the front
Okay. Could I ask you to send them out, please, Justin? Because I keep getting penalised for sending attachments to huge amounts of people. I get blocked and my things go to spam if I'm not careful. Okay.
What was the I suppose it's an April 4 dispute.
The next thing is one about how traumatic it must be for a child who, if it is discovered, they then have to tell the story to the police. And if they can't tell the story, that the amount of responsibility on them to make sure that that person is convicted. It will be tough because they're shut down, and they be too overwhelming to actually say what's going on.
Yeah. Particularly if this person, you're the only person in the family and that has experienced this, and the person is your brother or your uncle or your dad or your mum or your sister or your,
And that's sudden realization that something wrong has happened that you believed was okay because that's how you've been.
And I feel angry when I think of what's happened to people, and sometimes when I'm speaking to people there's no anger, and so I might ask them, where is the anger about what's happened to you? I'm feeling angry. I own it as my own anger. I feel angry when I listen to their story. And looking at this slide here, working with guilt or anger, sometimes a good question is, if you stopped blaming yourself, what might you be angry about? So what they're doing at the moment, the self-blame is like an anger against self. So if you stop blaming yourself, what might you be angry about? It's a hypothetical question. And then the other question is, what do I fear they might do if they became angry? So they might be pushing the anger down because they might feel murderous, or they might feel self-destructive. So there might be a lot of fear because there might have been a lot of anger around sexual abuse. You deserve this. Some abusers will use their anger to overcome the idea that what they're doing is wrong. Or alcohol. So sometimes there's a lot of a crossover with anger. If I get angry, then I'm as bad as that person.
Because there's always a fear that they may become that person.
Yes.
As an adult.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of fear and anger going on, isn't it? I think what strikes me also is about a child, because they haven't expressed the emotion of when the abuse was happening.
Mm.
They're not quite sure what the emotion actually is.
Mm.
So I think it's that longer story or that longer journey, isn't it? Thinking about revulsion and about, you know, the inappropriateness.
Mm.
You just know you didn't feel it.
Mm.
You just know you felt something, but you didn't put a name it. You couldn't label it.
Mm.
There's no freedom in your child.
So feeling the need to speed on and finish up a huge area. Dealing with anger, screaming can be a good one, depending on the person or the context. They might want to leave their screaming until they go home. If you hear screaming, it might just be part of the therapy. It might not be the therapist being attacked. Writing a no-send letter, an angry no-send letter, you know, no holds barred, say exactly how you feel in the letter, swear in the letter if you need to, talking to a chair or a photograph, that can be helpful. Imagery, so disputing, arguing, yeah, but you say that I upset you, but you were an adult. Yeah, I didn't deserve what you did, no matter how angry you were. That is confronting it, and with an adult head.
Yeah,
that's the disputing part. Okay, punching the cushion, pillow, the bed. Physical exercise is good because it helps you get out of your system. I know that a lot of people do that. Kickboxing and stuff can be quite helpful. In the right, I watched this therapy centre where they had a pile of plates and people tried and so the Greek must be very happy. Or not, because that's how they deal with it. Okay. So also writing down the key reasons why it's not my fault is quite helpful for clients. So this is in the area of dealing with the non-abusive parent. So in the book, they call it the mother, but if the mother was the abuser, it might be the father or the sibling. But the thing about siblings is that siblings will also disempowered often. You know, so they might have been put in a position where they were parentified, made to look after younger children that they weren't emotionally able to look after. So helping people to mediate between, you know, it's different when an 11-year-old abuses a 5-year-old, because if you look at the average 11-year-old, then yes, they're much more aware than a 5-year-old, but they're not the same as somebody who's 25 or 60 or whatever. So helping people to differentiate, and you can do that. You could use these exercises, but by then you will know who the abuser is and you can put in the right word instead of putting mother. So we're talking about the non-abusing person that should have known about it. So first questions are, did they really know about it? Abusers are very, very clever sometimes, and cover up tracks. So if they say they didn't know about it and the abuser was quite careful, then the child might think that the parent is omniscient, like parent knows everything, but not all parents know everything. So understanding, did they know about it? Had they got their own experiences in the past that might stop them from being able to see it? Or let's say there might be a level of denial, which is a psychological defense mechanism. So they might, if they hadn't been in denial, they might have been able to see some of the clues that they overlooked. Right. But that's not the same as knowing about it. And then there are the mothers that take their teenage daughters for abortion when they know that that's a member of their family that has caused that. So there's a level of knowing or not knowing, and sometimes that's really helpful for survivors to understand. And sometimes they're angry with their mother. I'm just using mother as a shorthand. Might be, I think the example in the book is stepfather. Why didn't the stepfather stop what my mother was doing? But stepfather knew about it, but didn't feel that because she wasn't his child that he had the right to. But you know, he should have intervened. But there are some reasons why people don't intervene. He thought that the mother might end the relationship with him and he would be homeless or something. So, you know, there are reasons why people don't, and understanding some of that could be quite helpful. Using some of those techniques, empty chair, letters, all of those kind of things you can use working with the perpetrator, but also the person that should have been there to look after. And it's really important to acknowledge with the client that all children deserve to be protected. There is not a child in the world that doesn't deserve protection, and they need to understand that you're coming at this trying to understand, not from an excusing a person point, but from helping them to deal with their abuse. It's not about saying this is okay. Signs of abuse. So the adult survivor might not have recognised the fact that they were wetting their bed as a sign, and they might have felt really bad about that when they were a child, and still might not connect the bedwetting with the abuse. So going back and understanding some of that thing, helping the inner child, talking to the inner child might be helpful. Letters from and to the inner child. Let the child write and then respond as an adult, because what you're trying to do is enable this adult to use, so going back to the internal family systems, to allow a part of the self to nurture a part of the self. So adult, parent, inner child. And that's how you come out of therapy, because actually you have this internal person that's then able to speak logic, comfort that part of the self that's suffering. So we're helping the client to develop this internal parent, if you like, that's going to help their inner child to survive. And sometimes people have difficulties relating to children because they just can't stand to see the vulnerability, or so an understanding why a person can't deal with children is quite helpful for some adults. It's not just that I'm a bad person or I don't like children. It's because they trigger me. And then being very careful about ending with clients. making sure that you do things like relapse prevention. So there are a list of exercises in the book that you can help, going back to the initial things. This is how I was at the beginning of therapy, this is how I am at the end, and just kind of celebrating the work and the change that's been done, comparing the before and the after, which of course you can't compare the after if you haven't done the before. Yeah, thinking about how have my feelings about myself changed, thinking about how they're using their coping strategies and what symptoms are all about. So basically that whole list of things is enabling the person to see their own journey and how they have contributed. You've not been a magical therapist. They have worked through this for themselves, and here is the journey that they've been on. And then working through what are the things about me that I need to develop now that I might not have developed. So what would it be like if I followed my dreams and worked as a teacher or volunteered for a youth group or something like that, because I've been wary about being with children. Maybe I've missed something in my life. How can I, where do I take my life from here? So enabling the client to work through the abuse, but then to start thinking about what does the future look like now? That might be, I'm not going to have anything to do with my family anymore. Could be that. So it's not just leaving that person once you've worked through the abuse, it's helping them think about how they're going to put their life together now. What's going to change? How are they going to go forward from this therapeutic experience now they've been able to apportion responsibility where responsibility lies? What is their choice now? This is a person that has choices. This is a person that can say, no, that isn't right. I'm not going to put up with that. It doesn't matter really now that my dad is dying and he needs my help. My choice might be tough. I need to look after myself. So those are hard choices and need to be addressed before you finish working with somebody. What's the implication of what we've done and how we'll take that forward? So you can see this is going to be a long process for some people. Okay, that's it. So